Hello, everyone. It's awesome being back. Great conference. I feel sorry for all of you that tried to go to this awesome conference and cannot get rid of me, because I keep coming back. I'm actually going to go a full circle this time as well, because I think the first time I did ROC I ended up doing a talk about AngularJS, and topic of today is AngularJS. So if we start out with, who am I? Some of you might have seen me before. My name is Chris Klug. I work as a, I think my official title is technical dude at a company called WROC. So I go around speaking at conferences, I do training, I do mentoring, and I actually do write code once in a while as well. I try to introduce bugs into systems. And today's topic is Angular. So I'm going to talk about Angular tips from the trenches. And yes, I am talking AngularJS. Not the new Angular, no, sorry, it's not called Angular 2 anymore. It's just called Angular, because versioning is hard. I know that it's kind of old to go and talk about AngularJS, but quite an interesting question. How many of you guys are doing AngularJS development today? Hands up. How many of you have done AngularJS development sometime before today? It's quite a good number. How many of you are doing Angular 2 or Angular or whatever you wanted, the framework formerly called Angular 2? Almost as many. I'm quite impressed. So my thing is, I end up coming into projects where we actually do AngularJS still. Because apparently, clients that I have haven't quite understood the fact that you should always just upgrade your system whenever there's a new release. Right? You're in the middle of building something, and then there's a new release of something. You just scrap everything you've built so far, and you start over again. That's what I try to do. So I try to look at AngularJS and say, I don't want this to suck. And it is actually quite possible for AngularJS to not suck. So that's what I want to talk about today. And hopefully some of you will bring something home and you'll go, cool. Some of you will go, dude, that was really boring. I'm really sorry for that. I'll try to make it better the next time. Where are the organizers? I'll make it a fourth time. So first rule of doing AngularJS development is do not use Angular. And I'm not kidding. That is actually my main rule for any software development with a framework is do not use the framework. I just did 3 days of training in Sweden on Angular 2. And the main thing about doing Angular 2 development as well is do not use Angular 2. Does that make sense to anyone? Because as much as you can use, stay away from the framework you use, the better it is. Because as soon as you start using stuff from the framework without shielding you from it, the less likely it is that you can move away and the more ingrained into that framework you are. Whereas I prefer being able to potentially somehow move in the future to something else. So avoid Angular, that's the best thing. Next thing, inline is evil. So for those of you who do AngularJS development, you might have seen code, I'm actually going to just go straight into this, seen code that looks like this. So is that, can you see that in the back? Ish, does it need to be bigger? Bigger? How big? Somewhere around there? Is that okay? And if I then do this, you can actually see some of the code? That makes sense? Okay, I saw a thumb in the far back, thank you. You got great hairdo as well, it's just like mine. Yes, exactly, thanks. Actually, it's kind of a lack of a hairdo, it's not a hairdo. Anyhow. So this is what you see when you start doing Angular development. You just write this. You write a JavaScript file, and you create an Angular module, and then you just do .controller. You name your controller, and then you create a function, and then you do all of your functionality inside of that function. So this is my controller. And then when I'm done with that controller, I just create a new controller, and then you add your inline features in here. So you inline all of your code in this one file. That's awesome, right? You get this. In the end, you will have a file that's 3 or 4 megs of just pure text JavaScript. And whenever you need something fixed, you just go Control F and you search for it. And when you're in a team, it gets kind of annoying because you get merge conflicts every single time you check something in. Do not ever, 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 ever write this piece of code. If I ever see any one of you doing inline code like this, where everything is in one place, I will come and find you. My favorite expression is, I will Freddy Krueger you. Because this is the worst thing you can ever do. And you can do this in a lot of languages. To be perfectly honest, there's nothing that stops you from writing your entire application in C# using a single CS file. Would anyone ever think that that was a good idea? I had a client, actually I did have a client who had a constructor function that was 1,700 lines long. I think he tried, but it wasn't very good. So inline versus modular. Do not do inline. So what does modular mean? Well, kind of instead of doing that inline thing where you do everything in one place like this, a very simple step that most people do realize quite quickly is that you don't do that. Instead, you update your application. So I'm going to slowly go through and how to make the application useful. If we look in here, we do an app.js file like this. So the app.js is the only place where I actually integrate a whole lot with Angular. So here I create my module, I set up my module name, I register my controllers, but I pull my controllers out of that file and I put them in individual files instead. Which I will fix this going on, but it also means that this function or this file here, it's still quite ugly, but it's actually a bit more testable. Because this controller is now not a part of Angular. If I want to do a unit test on this, I don't want to have to go and boot up Angular and host this inside Angular and so on. I can just pull out this thing, and I can run my unit test on it without even having to have Angular running. So I can do my unit tests in Node instead of having to do them in a browser, for example. So modularizing like this means that we also get a bunch of different files, and we can actually work on it as a team. Is there anyone out there who is still doing, you're allowed to tell me now, and I won't Freddy Krueger if you admit it, is anyone still doing inline stuff like this? Yeah, I'm not going to get an answer for that one, am I? Is anyone at the point where you're doing this, you're basically just moving things out to separate JavaScript files and everything looks nice? At least one person, okay. So you got a bit of maturity. But it's still kind of crap. But the reason for doing this is that it's actually impossible to maintain it unless you do that move. Step one, move everything out. Move it in separate files. It's unstructured, untestable if you do it the other way around. It's coupled, and also main problem with it, because I don't test code. Who tests code? I talk about it being possible to unit test because it sounds good, and it makes me sound really smart. I never write unit tests. And also, it's impossible. It's either coupled. Yes, I hate coupling things. Talking about doing it together with other people, and it's hard in a team to just have one big file. People don't want to work with me, so I only need one file because it's just me. But for everyone else, that's not a good solution. The next thing you want to realize when you've got everything into different files is that $scope is crap. The first thing you learn when you do AngularJS development is you use $scope. You pull in this little thing, you just write $scope in your function, and Angular will give you this magical being that will data bind things for you in the UI. And they never really go and tell you that you should never touch that thing. It's the worst thing you can do, because all of a sudden you're coupling yourself to Angular, and you can't get away from $scope. And $scope is generally something you don't want to touch at all because it's complicated. So a while back, a long time ago, they decided that we're going to change the syntax. So instead of what we're doing in this code here, where we pull in, into our controller, we pull in a $scope, and we set properties on the scope like this, and we declare functions on it like down here, $scope.selectItem and things like that. They decided that that's a bad practice. We'll still leave all of the demos out there so you can see how you do it wrong, but we're going to tell you sort of on the sidelines that this is the wrong way to do it. So they introduced something called ControllerAs. Using ControllerAs, together with the previous things of splitting things into separate files, we end up with files that look like this. We still do need to bring in scope in this case. I'm getting rid of that completely in a little while. But we use this. And then being JavaScript, you can obviously not use the keyword this, right? Because JavaScript is screwed up, so this is kind of maybe this and maybe something else, and in a lot of cases, something you don't think it is. So you never want to touch this either in JavaScript. So the first thing we do is we create a variable called self, and we assign this to self, and then apparently self works. Go figure. Then we assign things to ourself instead. The cool thing with that, if we look away from the little watch here and we look at things like this, we do self.selectItem equals a function. This means that we're actually creating a regular old class which assigns things to itself. So it has properties on itself. It's not reflecting everything that it wants to do on a separate object and let that object do things. I'm actually taking hold of my responsibilities inside this controller and say, I will have a title property. I will have a function that can do things. I will do things for you. Details controller is the same. It goes and says, I have details. And then when something changes, I have details. And the name of me is this, and so on. The cool thing with doing that is we get away from asking scope to do things for us. We do things in our own space. We're basically coupling things or enclosing things into one class. And also when we go in the view, we go ahead and say data-ng-controller, and we say app controller as CTRL, which means that all of our data bindings then become ctrl.title, ctrl.isLoading, ctrl.select, and things like that. It means that we get our own little universe of our own little classes, and once again, you can unit test it. It becomes its own thing. It's not dependent on $scope and things like that. You get more control. How many are not using ControllerAs today? There's one hand. You're doing it wrong. Go home, fix. Now, obviously, you can choose how much you want to do, but basically, I'm going to slowly go through step by step, and if you figure out that you're on this step, at least you're not in the previous two ones. So basically, you can take this, and you can look at future versions and see what we can do more, but ControllerAs is literally a must. You cannot keep working without it, in my opinion. Why? Well, once again, you end up with a unit of code that does its own thing. It's completely enclosed into its own thing, and it doesn't care about other things around it. And whenever we write code, we really want to make sure that our classes do one thing and they do their own thing. They are not dependent on 57 other things to do what they are supposed to do. So in this case, just doing data bind against me and my properties. Don't give me something that I attach my things to. Just be happy with me. I tried to tell my counselor that as well, but she's not happy with me. Anyhow, $broadcast and $emit. How many are doing messaging in your applications? Not just AngularJS. How many of you are using a message bus or a service bus or something like that in your application? Okay. Angular thought it was a brilliant idea to build that into Angular, which was brilliant. Messaging in applications is a great way of doing things. Unfortunately, the Angular team kind of fucked that up completely. They decided that they're not going to have messaging. They're going to have messaging going like all over the application. We're just going to go up and down. So I can only issue messages up to my parent or down to my children. And also, they named it broadcast and emit. Can someone easily come up with whether or not broadcast is passionate up or down versus emit, is that up or down? Anybody know? No, because nobody cares. It's like, you should have named it better, and we should have been able to figure it out easily. And also, hopefully, you don't know this because you're not using it, because it's crap. If you're doing broadcast and emit, pull it out and stop using it. Go into your project, go Control-Shift-F in Visual Studio, search for $broadcast, and whenever you find it, you're doing it wrong. If you find it in a lot of places, you're doing a lot of wrong. So try and get that out of there. Go and get a message service instead. I love the fact that messaging is in there and that we can use messaging, but we need to have something more flexible. So if you looked at the code that I had before, my app controller would do in here when something, let's go up one more step. It's easier to see in this one. In this thing here, there it is. It does broadcast item selected. So what that thing does, it basically tells all of my children that somebody selected something in me, you have to go and do something else. So messaging is awesome. The only problem with messaging is that it goes up and down, and if it's not me trying to communicate between a child and a parent, I actually want to communicate with siblings, you end up with a weird situation where I have to pass something up to a parent and then down to someone else, and you have to do a bunch of weird logic. It is so easy to just go in and say, I'm going to add another library in here. I'm going to add something called Postal.js. Because Postal.js is a proper pub-sub messaging system. I wrap that Postal.js stuff in a messaging service. which then has a subscribe function and a publish function. And that also means that when I use it, I ask for, in my constructor here, I say, can you give me a messaging service? Angular will give me an instance of that service. And I can down here, there it is, say messaging service.publish. And in my details controller, I can say messaging service.subscribe. And to me, it's a lot more obvious what publish and subscribe means than broadcast and emit. It also, as I said, it means that I can push messages sideways and this, there, and everything, and I can actually hook things up much more complicated. I can have services in the background that listens to messages in the system and do logging and things like that. So a messaging service is something that ends up being put into pretty much all of the applications that I build. Why? Well, messaging, first of all, it's named wrong with the broadcast and emit, and it annoys me. Second of all, it's a feature that's attached to $scope. And since my first slide was stay away from Angular, and $scope is Angular, my third slide was stay away from scope. I think that was the third slide. All of this is wrong. So if I want to get rid of $scope, I have to get rid of messaging from within Angular, and I have to go and build my own system. And as I said, it's just a few lines of code with a separate library, and you're done. And also, the sideways communication. The ability to communicate across my application in an easy way. It starts out with wanting to send a message from a parent to a child or a child to a parent, and then all of a sudden you end up with, oh, I want to send it to a sibling controller instead. And then all of a sudden you go, oh, it would be kind of cool if I could log this thing. And slowly but surely your application starts growing, and you realize that that messaging service, the more messages you put on that service, the more flexibility you have. The more you can go in and say, ooh, when this thing happens, I want to go and do this. When this thing happens, I want to go and do this. And it doesn't have to be UI-based stuff. It can be much more mundane things, as I said, like logging, like communicating with servers, like keeping track of when people are logged out and things like that. So it's a way for us to communicate throughout our application. And this is not just AngularJS. This is Angular in general, or rather, to be perfectly honest, any application that you build should have a messaging service, in my opinion, because it simplifies a bunch of things. $watch and $on. So $watch is a way for us to say, whenever something changes, I want you to tell me that it changes. That's nice. And something that we really need in Angular. We do want to get notified when things change, but we don't want to use $watch. Because the problem with $watch is that, once again, it's on the scope object, so we need to take in $scope. We have to take a dependency on Angular to get it done. And all of a sudden, I am trusting Angular to do things again, and I don't trust Angular. And also, $on $destroy is something that I need to pull in just because I have $watch. Because if I set up a watch in Angular, I'm actually using resources to watch something and look for changes, which means that whenever my controller is unloaded, I have to go in and listen to the destroy event as well and say, whenever my controller is destroyed, I want to unsubscribe to this watch that I'm doing. Which means that just because I want to get notified of a change, I actually have take a pretty heavy dependency on Angular. I kind of don't like that. There's a way around that. And this is going to look a bit messy, I know. It will get better, but this is an initial version of it. It changes over time. So I've got my controller. But as you can see here, I am now completely come away from $scope. I don't take in $scope at all. Oh, I'm still taking in $HTTP, but trust me, I'll get rid of that stupid thing as well. I'm going to hide that somewhere as well. So $scope is now gone, and instead of having to say $scope.on and whenever the query changes, I just have a method called onQueryChanged. So I just announce to the world in my controller that I have a function that gets called whenever the query changes, and I don't really care who calls it, somebody will do it for me. And that thing that does that for me is a directive. So I have a new directive here called app_directive, which returns, it creates a directive with its own scope. And it says, can I get an instance of this controller, my app controller? through the injector service. And the thing is, I don't mind going Angular specific in directives. I'm happy with using all of Angular within my directives. If Angular can give me anything that I need, I'm fine having it there because a directive is a pure Angular specific thing. If you can stay away from it and it's not Angular specific, then leave it. But things like the directives, which is a Angular specific thing, that thing can go and hug Angular and make out as much as it wants. So what it's going to do is going to use the injector and say, can you give me an instance of app controller? And I'm going to tell it that the scope that I want it to use is this thing here. And I set up my scope here using a value. I'm going to show you how to use this in a little while. But the cool thing is, by doing this in a directive and instantiating my controller, I have access to my controller and I have access to the scope. So I can, inside of my directive, now say, dude, I want to watch this thing. I want to get notified when something changes. And when something changes, I'm going to go and tell my controller that, hey, the query changes, and here's the new value. And also, since I'm in here and I'm doing a watch, I can do my listening to $destroy and handle that, the unsubscribe of my listener as well, in one place in my directive. This directive takes the hit of being coupled to Angular while freeing up my controller from the rest of the world, from the rest of the Angular stuff and keeping it free, right? And using this thing, if we look into index.htm, instead of saying data-ng-controller, I say data-novatrox-app, and I tell it what name to use for my data binding. So I'm not using the ng-controller directive. Instead, I'm using my own directive to do the instantiation of my controller, add the controller with the scope, and then listen to my watches, and I get complete abstraction away from Angular. So at this point, except for the $HTTP that I'm still using in here, there's nothing in here that's Angular specific, and I could literally take this class and pull it out and use it without Angular. I can use this class in pretty much a vanilla JS application, but I still have all of the features that I need. Does that make sense? Half of the crowd is not sleeping, going, this is old stuff. AngularJS, who cares? Sorry, not all of us can be on new tech. In a little while, people will come down and give you cool new tech, and I'll be just the old guy in the corner. Is that okay? Why? Well, you need to get away from $scope. I am paranoid about $scope, I know. Chris, you're crazy. Yes, I am. I'm very well aware of it. But I'm getting, as I said, to a point where my AngularJS application actually has a bunch of the code, a lot of the functionality and all of the logic in my application is getting further and further away from Angular, leaving me with a pure JavaScript implementation, which allows me to, in a few iterations, actually take most of my code and go and say, Angular, I don't like you anymore, I'm going to split up with you, and I'm going to move in with my new girlfriend who's Angular 2. Or, Angular, I don't like you at all and all of your family, so I'm going to go and do React. Or whatever, Aurelia, or whatever you want, because all of your code is completely abstracted away from your framework. $HTTP. My last little gripe in this application is that I'm using $HTTP. And to be perfectly honest, it's mostly those two services that you use in Angular. You use the $scope to do the data binding, and you use the $HTTP to do requests to the server. I don't like it. I generally dislike using $HTTP anywhere. I do the same thing when I'm moving to Angular 2. So for those of you in Angular 2 land, this actually is as much for you. Don't ever, 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 anywhere bring in a HTTP reference from Angular into your code. Put it 2 levels away from you. You're really paranoid when you want to have 2 levels between you and the framework that you're working with. But I really mean 2 levels. So in this case, what we've got now is, if we look inside of this thing, if we look at the old code that I've got, you see this here. $HTTP.get, and then it does a request to a URL endpoint here, or an HTTP endpoint here, querying the Spotify API. And then when that thing comes back, I get the response.data.artist.items to figure out what it returned to me, and then I data bind that using the self.items like that. This is fine. This works for a demo, but the problem is, what happens when the API endpoint is more complicated? What happens when we need to add authentication? Oh, crap. Oh, okay, so you need to authenticate it. That means that all of my 53 different controllers that do $HTTP and do requests to Spotify needs to set up an authorization header that needs to be sent with every request. So now I need to duplicate that in all of my 53 controllers. And then somebody goes and says, well, Chris, you suck as a developer. Yes, I know. But why do you mean I suck in this case? Well, because you're not doing any error handling. If this doesn't work, your application is just going to explode and stop working. And my defense is the Spotify API is up a lot. It doesn't go down. So I'm just going to trust that it works, right? If I were to be a good developer and write some error handling code, I would replicate that all over the place as well. Because I would have to have error handling code in every single one of my controllers that uses $HTTP. And it would need to treat things like 404s and unauthorized and all of the other things you can get from an HTTP request. And I litter that all over my controllers. And I have it all over my code. And then you want to log that. And then you get logging stuff all over your code and all of that. So definitely not a great idea. You want to put a couple of layers in between. And also, just another one. Looking at this application, this call here, is it very obvious to see what I'm actually doing, what I'm going to get back from the server? Yes, it's very obvious, because you just read here. It says https://API/Spotify. You're going to Spotify. Can figure that out. You're using their V1. I can figure that out. Let's see here. You're doing a search. Figure that out. And you're probably searching for artists, because that's in here. I don't want to go and do that. I don't want to go and read your code and look at URLs to figure out what you're doing. I want to look at the code and go, OK, so you're searching for our artists, and that's fine. So whenever you do want to do HTTP requests, you want to integrate with servers and backends and things like that, you do want to abstract that way. And you want to introduce something like this. In this case, I'm keeping myself to just one layer of abstraction. I'm doing a Spotify service. And then inside of my Spotify service, I take a dependency on $HTTP. And this Spotify service that you get here is nice, because it takes $HTTP, shields my controllers from it. It exposes a search artists function that takes a query. And then once again, if I was a good developer, I would have error handling logic in here and return good things. But it means that I keep all of this in one place, and I'm shielded from it in my controller. So my controller looks all this niceness in here, where I'm now taking in a Spotify service. And then it's quite easy for me to see that Spotify service.search artists. I know exactly what I'm doing. It's obvious what my code is doing. And I get, in this case, it's not TypeScript, so I don't get types, but what I'm getting back is actually what I asked for. That's another thing. Using this, I get back a list of artist objects that I can use to data bind. When we're using $HTTP, like in the previous example, you actually get back an HTTP response object, which in turn happens to have a data property, because that's what Angular gives you, which then happens to have artist.items. I don't want to litter all of my controllers with HTTP-specific things. I want to get, like, I'm asking for artists. Just give me an array of artists. That's what I need. I don't want to get the response back that I need to mess with, shield all of that into something else. And as I said, I normally have another layer. I would, in general, in my code, have my own custom HTTP service that my Spotify service would use. So I would have another layer in between, for the very simple reason that that gives me one place where I can do all of my HTTP requests, and I can then piggyback on that service and say, if any of the requests you're doing in anywhere in my application happens to come back with an unauthorized, I can tell the user to log in. Whenever something comes back with a 404, I can log that. Whenever something like this happens, I can do this thing. So I can do a bunch of fallbacks on my HTTP service. Once again, this is not Angular specific, JS specific. This is Angular 2 and all other frameworks as well. But it allows me to handle all of my potential exceptions in one place and not scatter it all over. I can even do little funky things like, if I have my own HTTP service, I can listen to unauthorized requests. So if I have a short-lived token or a token that expires when people are working, how many of you have been on a web form? This is not as common anymore, but do you remember the old days when you were in a web forms and you were writing a long email or you were writing a long reply, and then you'd push submit, and you'd get redirected to the login page, and you'd log in, and you'd come back, and all of your text was gone? Happened to anyone? Love is really big at that point, right? You just want to find the developer and hug him and thank him so much for fucking up your application. That is a pretty bad scenario. We had a situation where we built an application where we knew that there was going to be this problem. Weirdly enough, we knew that this problem was going to happen because the client said, we often have people sit down and enter a lot of information and then go for a coffee before pressing submit. Why can't you just do everything in one? But we couldn't control it. So we looked at different scenarios of how can we handle people getting logged out. Is there any way that we can make sure that when they get logged out, that we can log them back in and persist all of the information? And we easily floated, or initially floated the idea that whenever we had a form, when you pressed submit, we'd serialize the form information, we'd put that into local storage, and then if you got logged out, you would be redirected to the login page, and whenever you logged in, we'd check local storage, figure out where you needed to go, and then go to that page and rehydrate the information in that serialized form and post it again. Does that sound like a good idea? Does it sound like a lot of work? Does it sound like a lot of moving parts that could crap itself? So what we did instead, we said, no, that sucks. There are too many variables in there, there are too many moving parts, there are too many things that can go wrong. But we have an HTTP service. We know exactly whenever somebody does an HTTP request that gives an unauthorized back. So whenever we get an unauthorized back, let's catch that in the HTTP service layer. When we get an unauthorized, we save that promise that did that request, and we send a message on my message service. Look how all of this just ties together. So I send a message on the message service and says, the guy has been logged out, can somebody log him back in again? We had an authorization service that would go off and pop up a new window. The user would log in to the login form. We would get a token back. The authorization service would tell the HTTP service that the guy is now logged in again, and we would rerun the HTTP request again with everything stored in memory, and the save would go through. And on the surface, on our controller side, when we called save, we get a promise back, and we didn't have to care. So all of that whole loop of having to go off and log in and redirects and everything was hidden to us, and the regular application developer that was just building a form that had a save button could just go and say, save, and whenever you're done, come back and tell me, and I don't really care if the user has to log in and all of that as well. Make sense? It was awesome. Did it work? I don't know, because I left before the application was done. I think it worked. So why would you do it? Well, first of all, you don't want to have repetitive code all over the place. So you don't want to have logging stuff all over your application. You don't want to have error handling all over the application. You don't want to spread out API endpoints and URLs all over the application. It's all about keeping your code dry and not repeating yourself. Because that's another thing. I've built this little stupid application that searches Spotify, but I'm more likely to build a full Spotify application that uses more of the API, which means that I'm going to call a bunch of different endpoints, and it would be kind of nice to have all of those endpoints in one place. I know that if Spotify ever changes their API or moves it, don't know why they would, but if they ever do, I can switch it all in one place. Or I could put up a fake endpoint that basically mimicked my request to Spotify, and I could do unit testing or integration testing using a fake backend in a simple way. And also simpler usage. It's just so much easier to write Spotify service.search artist than writing $http.get long string, concatenate something else, and then do this, and then when you get response back, look at the data, look at this, look at this, look at this. The average developer can just go and say, search artist, I'm good. Providers, another thing. I see, this is one of those I actually see a lot of, and it annoys me. I see a lot of people just chugging services into Angular and not having any configuration possibilities. not being able to configure endpoints, not being able to configure this, that, and everything. Instead, you have two options. Either they hard code everything, like I just did, which is awesome. Whenever something changes, you have to change your application. It also means that when you don't have configuration going into your application, it means that you're going to have to build your little JavaScript library uniquely for every different environment you're going to put it inside of, which is a pain in the butt. Instead, we do want to do configuration. So configuration is, in AngularJS is done using providers. So if we look at the provider sample I've got here, I've got a few providers in here, I've got some scripts. In my app.js, and I've got my service, my messaging service. I got my provider now that goes to Spotify service, which goes to Spotify service provider. And I've got a configuration here that says novatrox.app.config. And if we look at novatrox app.config, which is up here, this is the most stupid configuration you can have, but it makes sense. I don't know how that works together, but it kind of does. I have a configuration to be able to put in delays. Basically, I have a way to configure a thread.sleep inside of my code. Anybody like having thread.sleeps in your code? Yeah, somebody's shaking their head. It's like, the guy on stage is stupid. No, there's a point to this. There is a real point. If you're working, so Spotify was not a good example here, but if you're working locally with an API backend for your JavaScript application or your Angular application, and you're sitting on your machine, and you press a button, it does an HTTP call to your local machine, and it gets the response back, how long is that going to take? It's going to be like that, yeah. And then you publish this thing to the real world, where you're on a service somewhere in the other end of the world, and the API you're calling is on another end of the world, or if you're deploying them together, you're deploying it, and your user is sitting on a modem connection in deep jungles of India, maybe not happening, but if it does, the person presses the button, it doesn't go like that. There is latency going to the server, there's latency processing it, there's latency coming back. It's going to take a while for that response to come back. How are you, as a developer on your local machine, going to test what the UI looks like and what the user sees when a slow connection is being in there? Anybody think about that? Yes, we have, Chris, because you go to Chrome and you go to the developer tools and you set slow connection and it does it for you. Yes, you can do that, but this is not a way of doing it. It's based on another sample we had, which was our version of Chaos Monkey from Amazon. We had a configuration where we could set a percentage of how often the thing threw an exception when you made a web request. So when you were working with it, it would actually throw exceptions and you would be forced to figure it out. I don't know if that was a good idea, but we did it. It was fun. But what we're doing here is we say, I have a Spotify service provider, and I pull out a default here. So this is my default value. The delay is 0, which is a good default. Then I use angular.extend. Let's close this. And I say, so I want to extend this defaults object with the object in window.appconfig or empty object. And then I take that config, and I pass config.delay into my Spotify service in the set delay. And inside of my Spotify service provider, which is in here, Spotify service provider, I have a delay of 0. I pass in a new delay for it, which happens to be 0 or whatever I tell it. And then when I call, Angular calls $get to get an instance of Spotify service, I pass in the delay to my Spotify service. And Spotify service then has up here, it says, when you call search artist, I'm going to actually go and do a $timeout and wait for the delay that you've told me to before I make the request. And actual configuration is in my web page. So I just declare a variable in here. I name it appconfig. I give it all of my configuration values. And then in my configuration piece here, the appconfig, I read that value and I use those values to configure my services and I get everything back. That means that my services don't go and say, because I could just as well in my Spotify service go and say, if there is a property called app-config on the window object, I want to use that, and so on. And every single service would be required to go and look for its own configuration instead of getting it injected, which sucks, because then all of a sudden you're running this code, and somebody tells you that that Spotify service you built the other day is awesome, I want to use that in Node. That would work fine, except for the fact that I'm dependent on there being a window object. And in Node, for some reason, or pretty obvious reason, there is no window object, and my code goes poof. Doing this, my Spotify service provider and my Spotify service, with the Spotify service just saying, can you please give me a delay, I can go and use this code anywhere else, including Node or whatever I'm doing. So providers are good. You do want to configure all the things that you're doing. So why is configuration important? Well, how many of you guys are running just one environment? How many of you are sitting on your machine, coding an application, and you go into Visual Studio and you right-click and do deploy, and then you deploy it to the production server straight up? Nobody? Somebody's lying in here. There is not a room of 400-ish developers that do not do that. That's not possible. Well, actually, it's 400 and then me, and I just held my hand up because I do that. For certain projects. We do have different environments. We do have UAT environments, we have development environments, we have test environments, we have the production environments, we have all of these different environments, and by doing configuration like this, it means that moving things around from the different environments means one build, one deploy, and then config. I've seen so many cases when that's not the case, and it just ends up being a pile of crap. This thing has stopped working. Okay, let's do it like this. TypeScript. This is where it starts getting interesting. I know stuff so far has been, who cares? How many people love TypeScript? What's wrong with the rest of you? How many people love JavaScript? No, there are a few hands. There are a few people that are wrong. I'm happy to admit it. No, seriously, I do both. But I am moving more and more to a world where I don't touch JavaScript. If a client comes to me with a JavaScript-specific job, I will write my code in TypeScript and transpile it and give them the JavaScript. I don't want to do JavaScript because TypeScript is so much easier to work with. It removes a whole heap of bugs that you have available to you in JavaScript, and it solves kind of, potentially, maybe a little bit of the this variable and things like that. And there's nothing that keeps me from writing TypeScript in Angular. Unfortunately, very few people do it. The people I see still use JavaScript. But we can move everything over to TypeScript. Not a problem. I have exactly the same application here. Got a TypeScript configuration, which is just a basic, hey, compile to ES5, use modules stuff. I still load everything in here. No, actually, I don't. I updated it, sorry. I've also updated it to use system.js in here. So I don't want to go and tell my web page that you need to load these 3 files and you need to load them in this order. I just want to tell my web page, can you please just go and load the freaking app for me? It starts here, and then system.js will actually figure everything else out. So system.js will take the app.js file, and inside the app.js file there will be references saying, for me to run, I need file X, Y, and Z as well. And when system.js sees that, it goes and says, OK, I'll download X, Y, and Z as well. If they need files, I'll go and download those files as well. If they need files, I will go and download those as well. It builds a massive graph of all the files that your application needs. It inserts them into your web browser in the right order and sorts everything out for you. And you know how much work you have to do to get it to work? You have to write this. And then you're done. It just works. So what it does, it basically says, all my files are in the scripts folder. If anybody asks for something called Angular, which might happen in an Angular application, I want you to go and get that file. No, you generally want to go and get angular.min.js, but we'll just leave it like that. And also, for the Angular application, or Angular module, it's a global module, and inside of it there will be a variable called Angular that needs to be made available globally for my application. With that configuration in place, I can go to my scripts. I can go and have a look at my app.ts, which is now a bunch of TypeScript instead. It uses the ECMAScript/TypeScript module syntax, so it uses imports. Whoops. So it basically says, I need the app config class from this file, I need my messaging service from this file, I need the service provider from this file. So it basically tells explicitly what things this file needs to run. And then it uses angular.module to say, these are the things that I need to register. And it registers my classes. And also, yeah, sorry, it also does one more thing. It bootstraps now. Since we're using system.js and we're asynchronously downloading all of our scripts, we cannot use the ng-app directive to start our application. We actually have to manually go in and say, when this file is loaded, I want you to go and get the document element, and then I want to use Angular to bootstrap my application. Pretty stock standard Angular stuff. Everything else is now TypeScript. Configuration, TypeScript. Kind of ish, at least. It uses classes. It exports stuff out of my module. A module is just a file. My controller. My controller is now sweet because it exports as a class. It imports just interfaces. So it's actually starting to look like a, sorry, but quote, real application where my abstractions are interfaces. So I do ask Angular for a messaging service, and I type that. So can I get an iMessaging service? Spotify service, can I get an iSpotify service? And I get IntelliSense. So on my Spotify service here, I get proper IntelliSense telling me what's available on my service, not weird JavaScript stuff. My Spotify service returns real objects now. So my iSpotify service takes a query, which is a string. It returns a promise of iArtistInfo array. So I get typed responses back from Spotify as well. Because iArtistInfo contains a name and an array of images. iImage. Every image contains a height, a width, a URL, potentially. And all of this is typed. So I can now write applications where I can go and say, Spotify service, go and get me all these things that start with Iron or Britney Spears or whatever, and I get array back, and I can iterate through the array, I can find all of the images, I can look at different sizes and things like that, and it's all typed. It's like writing in a real language. It's awesome. Did I just call JavaScript not a real language? Yes, I did. Yeah, thank you. There's a slow clap up here. Now, there's nothing wrong with JavaScript, but JavaScript has the problem that it's dynamically typed, which means that we cannot get IntelliSense. It's impossible to do proper IntelliSense with a dynamically typed language, which means that it introduces a bunch of potential bugs that cannot exist in a statically typed language. It introduces the idea that I can send back types of the wrong thing and stuff like that. TypeScript sorts that out for you. So why do we need TypeScript? Well, first of all, as I said, it's statically typed, so we get tooling, we get structure, we get IntelliSense, we get F12. Have you any idea how good the F12 key is in Visual Studio? For those of you who don't know what the F12 key is, go home and read. What it does is you go on a class, you press F12, and it jumps to the implementation. If you go and say Control F12 on an interface, it goes to the implementation of that interface. It's gold. It saves you so much time instead of that one big JavaScript file and Control-Shift-F. It's maintainable in a different way. And by maintainable, I mean it's possible to take a TypeScript application and build it in one team and then actually have another team take over, or you can switch out members on the team, because with tooling, you figure out how things work. In JavaScript, if you got a new team member and you got 4,000 files with JavaScript in it, you have to go and tell the developer, welcome to our team, read these 4,000 files, and then come back in a month and a half when you know every single thing that it says inside of it. I don't find that being useful. And also JavaScript modules, which I showed you now. JavaScript modules, together with TypeScript and together with a loader like system.js, is actually so much simpler than having to add all of my files manually. And it starts out with doing what I just did, and I have a bunch of loose files, and I tell system.js that this is my entry file, and it sorts everything else out. But when you come to bundling and minification, it changes. I don't want to do that. I don't want to read loose files. The cool thing is that with JavaScript modules and a bundler or a module loader, we can actually inside, let's take my build script here. This is a build file that I use from Node to build my resources. I go and require what is called a System.js builder module. So System.js is the module loader, and somebody has built a builder on top of that, which uses the same syntax and the same configuration, basically, as System.js. So I can then go and say, using System.js, here is where all my files are. This is the file that I want you to output. No, sorry, there's my configuration. And if we look at the config, it's basically just the same thing I put in my web page, except that I'm telling it to not include Angular for me. And then I tell it to do a build. Down here, I call do build with true and false. And I can just say, hey, builder, can you please bundle the application that starts at app.js and output it to this file name? And yeah, you might want to minify it as well if I tell you. And then this thing figures out the order of everything. I used to do gulp builds where you would go and write a glob pattern and say, can you please take all of the JavaScript files and bundle them for me? But oh, yes, I need these really weird rules on which order you need to bundle these for it to work. Anybody have that? It sucked. With this, you just give it one file, and it goes and does everything else, and it just uses JavaScript modules, which is really neat. And it outputs the files you need in the right order. So JavaScript modules, you can use that without TypeScript if you want to. Just remember that if you're doing it with TypeScript, TypeScript will do the transform from TypeScript import statements to whatever JavaScript module syntax you want. If you're doing it in JavaScript, you're doing ECMAScript 6, which no browser will actually support, which means that you're going to have to use Babel or something else like that to transpile from that syntax into some other module syntax that you can use. So JavaScript modules are on the way into the browser, but right now you need to use a module loader for it to work. Why do we bundle and minify? I don't even think I have to answer that. You really have to, because it gets smaller, less requests and all of that. It's just automagic. Most people will probably use Webpack today, but it's possible to do it like this as well. Components. How many of you have moved from AngularJS to Angular 2? How many love the new way of doing it? How many hate the new way of doing it? Okay, there's one guy hating it. You're wrong. It's a little bit different. And the interesting thing is that all the JavaScript frameworks are going in the same direction. They're building components. In Angular 1, we used to do a big HTML tree, and then we would attach controllers to the different branches in the tree and control the data binding through that. With components, we build a piece of code together with a binding scope and together with a template, and that's it. It doesn't interfere with anyone else. It's an enclosed unit that just does its thing, and it can then use other components to build other parts. So when you start an application using components, it actually looks like this instead. It removes all of the HTML in here, except for my script tags and everything, and it basically says, this is my start tag. I want you to render the application called Spotify Search, and that in turn will load up a component with a template and with functionality and insert into my page here, and that will in turn use other components, uses other components, that uses other components, and slowly they're all merged together to form a big HTML tree with all of the UI that you need, but every single component is standalone. So the only way to get information into a component is by data binding it into the component, and the only way to get it out of the component is by calling methods on the parent, so basically hooking up event handlers. That means that you cannot do things like you could do in Angular before, which is have your scope being inherited in, and you inherit information from a parent scope and things like that. And the reason that you don't want to do that is because it's going to mess with your code. That was probably the nice way of saying it. It sucks. It causes a bunch of problems. And it's not really hard to do either. If we look at my Spotify component, Spotify search component, this thing here, it's a normal class. It has a constructor. All of this is pretty much the same, except that I don't need that extra directive to do the when everything changes, and I don't need to do that when I do on destroy and things like that. And also with on init, I don't have to do things in the constructor. I actually have a separate method where I can start things. If I want to load some data from the server, the first thing I do, I don't want to do it in the constructor. I want to defer it until later, and then there's an implicit method called onInit that will be called whenever your component is initialized. The code here is pretty much similar. It's not a big difference in here. What is different is that in my app.ts, I go and say, I want to register components. My component is called Spotify Search. You register the component using camel casing, and then it gets converted into kebab casing. So Spotify with a lowercase s and search with a capital S will turn into Spotify-search in the HTML. You tell it, where is my URL template? Where is the HTML that I want to render? What controller do I want to use? That's my component. What do I want to call my controller inside of my template? So basically my ControllerAs syntax from before. And also, what bindings are available? What things can I insert and get out of this component? Well, in this case, title. You can insert title. And if we look at the index.html, you'll see here that it sets the title like this. And if we look at the Spotify list, it uses this syntax and says, whenever something is selected, so I have an onItemSelected function that I can hook up. So inside of my Spotify search template, you see inside my search template, I have a Spotify list. I have a Spotify details. And here I hook up onItemSelected. So whenever somebody selects something inside of that list, I want you to call this function here to notify me that something has been selected. So I get this nice encapsulated thing that does one thing. It's like, I will do a list, you tell me what to show, and I will tell you when somebody selects it. And you do unique encapsulated pieces that don't depend on a bunch of other things that you would, like you would do in old Angular. And the cool thing is that when you get to components, and you get to using TypeScript, there is very, very little between you and Angular 2. Because the whole thing with Angular 2 is, hey, we're building using TypeScript. Yes, so am I. We're using components. So am I. We're doing dependency injection. So am I. Yeah, there's not much more. That's about it. So you can actually take, if you're bored by your old AngularJS application and you wish you could do Angular 2, you can go ahead and slowly migrate your existing application to a point where you're almost doing Angular 2, and you can get the same IntelliSense, you can get TypeScript, you can get module loading, you can get all of the things that made Angular 2 interesting to work with, at least to me, and I can go and get that in Angular 1 as well, or AngularJS. Be creative. When you're building applications, do things like I said. Listen to unauthorized and then go and get people logged in and things like that. Using promises, you can do a whole bunch of magical things which shields the average day-to-day developer building components from all of the technical stuff of logging and authorization and all of that. Create vertical slices. Do not build your application horizontally sliced. Do not have somebody building the database, and then somebody building the API layer, and then you have somebody building the services, and then you have somebody building the components, and somebody doing the UI. Because if you slice things in that direction, your application will never be able to be dynamically or delivered slowly over time. You will have to wait until all layers are complete, and then you will deliver this big thing. If you slice the other way and say, I will build the feature user management from database to UI, I can give that to the testers, and they can work with it, and then I can go on and do the next vertical slice. So don't slice in that direction. Don't do layers. Slice everything vertically instead, because you can deliver things over time instead of having to wait until the end to deliver everything. Think about Angular 2, or Aurelia, or React, or whatever. Try to get away from binding yourself into your framework, because you do want to change sometime in the future. So the less you're dependent on your current framework, the less likely it is that you're stuck with that framework, and the more likely you are to be able to move in the future. Thank you, everyone. It's been awesome. If you have any questions, I'll be around.